The identity of the 144,000 should not be difficult to determine unless the reader is trying to insert themselves into the story. The text tells us plainly who they are. 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. The passage does not say believers from every nation. It does not say the church from all humanity. It says the tribes of Israel. If modern readers approach the passage without importing later theological assumptions, the conclusion is obvious. The 144,000 represents Israel. New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham observes that the tribal enumeration in Revelation is deliberate and symbolic, he says. The list of the 12 tribes makes clear that John is portraying the people of God as the true Israel, represented in symbolic form. Source: Bauckham, The Climax of Prophecy, page 216. As a former futurist Christian, I once believed something entirely different. In that framework, the 144,000 were imagined as future Jewish converts who would appear after Christians had been beamed off the face of the earth to hang out with Jesus in a cloud. They were essentially treated as a kind of reserve team that would only enter the game after the church had left the field. The narrative surrounding them was elaborate. A rebuilt temple would appear in Jerusalem, global war would erupt in the Middle East, and Jesus would return on a blood-drenched horse with his army of Christians to destroy Israel's enemies and establish a millennial kingdom. Within that storyline, 144,000 were future Jews who would finally recognize Jesus. It was an entertaining story, but it bears little resemblance to what Revelation actually says. John's vision identifies the redeemed in a different way. Revelation 5:8-9 says you were slain, and by your blood you purchased people for God from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. Notice the wording carefully. The text does not say that all tribes and nations were redeemed. It says that people were purchased from among them. The language describes selection, not universal inclusion. Later in the book, we discover who these redeemed people are. Revelation 14:1-3 says, Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. And they were singing a new song before the throne, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Three things are immediately clear. First, the 144,000 are associated with the 12 tribes of Israel in Revelation 7. Second, they are described as those who were redeemed. Third, they alone are able to learn and sing the new song of redemption. In other words, the group identified as the redeemed in Revelation 14 corresponds to the Israel identified group sealed in Revelation 7. According to New Testament scholar G.K. Beale, the 144,000 represent the faithful community of God's people portrayed as the true Israel. Source: Beale, The Book of Revelation, New International Greek Testament Commentary, page 416. The number itself is symbolic. 12,000 from each tribe multiplied by 12 tribes produces 144,000, a number representing the fullness of restored Israel. The symbolism communicates completeness, not a literal census of 12 restored tribes of Israel. The point is not the arithmetic. The point is the identity of the group being described. They represent the totality of the covenantally restored people of Israel. Apocalyptic scholar Adela Yarbrough Collins explains the number 144,000 is clearly symbolic, expressing the idea of the totality of the people of God. Source: Collins, Crisis and Catharsis, page 80. And New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham likewise notes that the 144,000 represent the complete. number of the servants of God drawn from Israel, the numbering signifies the restoration of Israel as the people of God. Source: The Theology of the Book of Revelation, page 74. Understanding the passage requires recognizing the covenant world in which these Israelites existed. By the 1st century, Israelites were not confined to the land of Judea. They had been dispersed among the nations for centuries. Acts records this reality clearly. Acts 2:5 says, "Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven." James likewise addressed his letter to the scattered tribes, saying to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, "However, it should be noted that most scholars agree that when the author of the Epistle of James addresses his audience as the 12 tribes in the dispersion per James 1, he is not claiming that 12 administratively distinct tribal groups still existed in the 1st century. Rather, the phrase functions as a traditional way of referring to the whole people of Israel, especially Israel, scattered among the nations. In the 1st century, synagogues and Israelite communities existed across many regions of the Roman Empire, but there were no established communities consisting of individual, administratively independent tribes. After the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, most tribal identities ceased functioning as social or political categories. By the Second Temple period, Jews generally identified themselves simply as Jews rather than by a particular tribe, with a few exceptions like Levi or Davidic descent. Anna, the prophets of the tribe of Asher per Luke 2:36, and Paul in Romans 11:1. Prior to the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, Israel had been organized around a tribal structure in which land inheritance, political leadership, and social identity were tied to the 12 tribes descended from Jacob. That structure was severely disrupted when the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom in 722 BCE and deported large portions of its population. Many inhabitants of the northern tribes were removed from the land and resettled elsewhere within the Assyrian Empire, while foreign populations were brought into the region. Over time, the original tribal distinctions of the northern kingdom faded from view. The Babylonian conquest of Judah in 586 BCE produced a similar disruption for the southern tribes. Large numbers of Judeans were deported to Babylon, the temple was destroyed, and the political institutions that once organized tribal life collapsed. When exiles eventually returned under Persian rule in the late 6th century BCE, the restored community was much smaller than the pre-exilic population and was composed largely of those who identified broadly as Judah or Jews. The earlier tribal structure of Israel was never fully restored. By the time of the Second Temple period, Jewish identity had become centered less on tribal affiliation and more on shared religious and national markers such as Torah observance, temple worship, circumcision, and participation in synagogue life. People generally identified themselves simply as Jews rather than as members of specific tribes. Historian Shay J. D. Cohen summarizes the situation this way. By the Second Temple period, the tribal system had largely disappeared. Apart from priests and Levites, Jews did not normally identify themselves by tribe. Source: Cohen, From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, page 69. There were a few notable exceptions. Priestly families preserved genealogies because temple service required verification of descent from Aaron and the tribe of Levi. Certain royal lineages associated with Davidic descent were also remembered, since messianic hopes were tied to the house of David. On rare occasions, individuals still referred to a tribal identity, as when Paul identified himself as of the tribe of Benjamin in Romans 11, and Anna the prophetess is mentioned as being from the tribe of Asher in Luke 2:36. Such references indicate that some families maintained ancestral traditions about their tribal origins, but they were the exception rather than the norm. For most Jews in the Second Temple world, identity was no longer organized around 12 functioning tribes, but around the broader category of Israel as a covenant people. As a result, expressions such as the 12 tribes continued to function primarily as symbolic language referring to the whole people of Israel rather than to 12 clearly identifiable tribal communities still existing in the first century. By the 1st century, the phrase 12 tribes had long functioned as a symbolic or collective term for the people of Israel. New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson writes, "The expression 12 tribes is a traditional designation for the whole people of Israel rather than a reference to 12 actual tribal groupings." Source: Johnson, The Letter of James, Anchor, Yale Bible. In similar fashion, James also uses the phrase in the dispersion. That term already had a recognized meaning in Jewish literature: Jews living outside the land of Israel. New Testament scholar Peter H. Davids notes the phrase 12 tribes in the diaspora is a way of addressing Jewish believers scattered throughout the world. Source: Davids, The Epistle of James, New International Greek Testament Commentary. With this understanding, the phrase scattered in the dispersion means the scattered people of Israel in the general sense. New Testament scholar Richard Borkham concurs, saying reference to the 12 tribes evokes the eschatological hope for the restoration of all Israel. Source: Borkham, James, Wisdom of James, disciple of Jesus the Sage. When Revelation speaks of people redeemed from every tribe and tongue and people and nation, it is describing the gathering of people from the dispersed covenant world. The language does not refer to every tribe and nation on the modern globe, but to the places where Israel's covenant people and those attached to them were scattered. The Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly predicted such a scattering and regathering. For example, Deuteronomy 4:27 says, "The Lord will scatter you among the peoples." Isaiah 43:5 says, "I will bring your offspring from the east and gather you from the west." Jeremiah 31:10 says, "He who scattered Israel will gather him." These prophecies form the background of the New Testament expectation that Israel would be gathered again in the last days. Jesus spoke in these terms. Matthew 2:31 has Jesus saying, "He will send out his angels, and they will gather his elect from the four winds." The elect in Israel's scriptures referred to God's covenant people. The gathering language echoes the prophetic promise that the scattered people of Israel would be restored. John's vision of the 144,000 fits squarely within that framework. The sealed Israelites represent the faithful remnant of Israel who would be preserved during the coming covenant crisis. Their sealing echoes earlier biblical imagery in which God marks his faithful people for protection during judgment. The description of them as first fruits reinforces this interpretation. John says in Revelation 14:4, "These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb." First fruits language comes from Israel's sacrificial and harvest system. It refers to the first portion of a harvest dedicated to God, symbolizing a larger work that follows. In Revelation, the imagery portrays the faithful remnant of Israel being gathered and dedicated to God at the close of the Old Covenant age. The vision also describes them as pure. Revelation 14:4 says, "These are the ones who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins." This language should not be interpreted literally. Revelation consistently uses marriage and sexual imagery as metaphors for covenant faithfulness or unfaithfulness. In the Hebrew prophets, idolatry is frequently described as adultery or prostitution. Israel's covenant relationship with God is portrayed as a marriage, and apostasy is described as spiritual adultery. The same symbolism appears throughout Revelation. The faithful people of God are portrayed as a bride, while apostate systems within Israel are portrayed as harlots. Therefore, the statement that the 144,000 are virgins describes Israel's covenantal fidelity, not physical celibacy. New Testament scholar David Owen explains the reference to virginity in Revelation 14 is symbolic language reflecting religious purity and faithfulness. Source: Owen, Revelation 6-16, Word Biblical Commentary, page 803. The virgins represent the faithful remnant who remained loyal to the Lamb rather than participating in the idolatry and compromise that characterized much of Israel during the final years of the Old Covenant system. Their purity is contrasted with the corruption of the surrounding religious world. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes, meaning they remained loyal to Christ despite the pressures and persecutions of their time. In this way, the 144,000 represent the faithful Israel that the prophets anticipated, the remnant through whom God would complete his covenant story. Revelation later identifies the bride of the Lamb in similar terms. For example, in Revelation 21, 9-12, John says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb, the holy city Jerusalem, with 12 gates, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of Israel." The imagery again points to Israel as the covenant community that stands at the center of the story. The message of Revelation is therefore not about the future salvation of the modern world, but rather the climax of Israel's covenant story. The faithful remnant of Israel, drawn from across the diaspora and joined by those lawfully attached to Israel's covenant life, would be gathered, redeemed, and preserved as the Old Covenant age came to its end. As such, the 144,000 symbolize that restored covenantal people of Israel. They are the sealed remnant of Israel who followed the Lamb during the final generation before the destruction of Jerusalem and the close of the Temple Age. Once that covenant crisis reached its conclusion, the redemptive narrative that had centered on Israel also reached its fulfillment.